After all of the antics of last weekend's Formula 1 race, do you want to know who is a happy man? Well, it's the guy who's in charge of Silverstone, Stuart Pringle. Because once the tyres went pop, the sales didn't stop. At the cost of a potential friendship. With the British Grand Prix previously having issues selling all of its tickets due to the ridiculously high ticket prices, there has been a sudden dash for them with just days to go before the first media day kicks off. And would you look at that, Max Verstappen is no longer being blamed for the lagging ticket sales, even though a general admission ticket for the grandstand is worth £1,000, and I'm researching tickets for the Austrian Grand Prix, and it's half that. The surge in last-minute purchases has something to do with the coming together with he and Lando making headlines across the world, as well as a British driver winning the race, but not the one that everyone had been talking about before Spielberg. So with tensions high between the two drivers, with only days after the incident happening and not enough time to really cool down about it, people will understandably want to be there in case something happens again. Which, honestly, I would rather not happen, and instead they actually learn from this and race really, really hard, but also cleanly, so there's no clashing or collisions, or one gets taken out and the other doesn't. But maybe we might see a situation where the good old British weather actually plays a part of it, with it being predicted to rain especially during Friday practice, with possibly a little bit of a sprinkling during Sunday. Whether or not it might be enough for intermediate tyres remains to be seen. Silverstone, eh? Not only is there British bias... Silverstone, eh? Not only is there British bias aplenty, but there's also the British weather. Oh, we're so miserable. I get it, the UK in general is expensive at the moment, and the track is trying to improve the on-track experience, according to Stuart Pringle, as well as us being aware that Liberty Media is quite egregious when it comes to the fees for hosting F1, but it's still one of the most expensive tickets out there, and I don't care if it's the home of F1, or whether or not it has an aura that some other tracks on the F1 calendar simply don't have, like some of the more recent tracks, but something needs to be done to limit the increase in ticket prices, or better yet, reduce the ticket prices. Because if you get Lewis Hamilton saying, something's not right here, we really need to make this more accessible for people, then something has to be done. I've already had my fill with Silverstone about 20 years ago. I remember going up there, sitting down at Priory. It didn't cost anything. I watched BAR, Renault and McLaren testing. I saw DC spin at Priory. Yeah, I've had my fill of Silverstone, and that was fun. I ate from a burger van. It was a sloppy burger. It tasted lousy, but that is just hardcore British motorsport culture, dang it. Anyway, onto the racing itself, and the Britishness does not stop, with Williams now having just revealed their special livery for the occasion. Literally, as I went up the ladder, they showed this off, and you thought that the Union Jack livery of last year was quite noticeable. This one, it's even more so. Crikey! Blimey! Holy moly! Insert George Russell expletive here. That is stark, and they call it spectacular, with all 1,000 plus names of the Williams staff being etched onto the car, and of course then superimposed underneath the Union Jack, with the white, red and blue. Okay, it's a little bit more grandiose than the Duracell bunny at Monaco, but, you know, the Duracell bunny at Monaco was, it was a lot more effective in giving the team their only points of the season so far. I understand there being some sense of patriotism. It's bold, that's for sure. It is the British Grand Prix. It's all understandable. I mean, okay, it's certainly a lot better than the Vegas livery, because that one was quite tacky. But then again, Vegas is tacky in of itself. Whereas, does this make me go, oh yes, it's proud to be British? No. I mean, it's accurate, and it's a nice tribute to the staff, so I suppose it doesn't really matter what I think. It's a nice gesture, and I can get behind that, so good on them. And also good on them for giving one of their Williams Driver Academy drivers an actual chance to drive a car, albeit at the expense of one of their own academy drivers, Logan Sargent, because in FP1, Franco Colapinto of Argentina will be taking up that seat, the first example of an Argentinian since the days of Gaston Mazzacane in 2001, and then before that, Esteban Tuero in 1998. And whilst I'm glad that Colapinto is getting to have a go and his F2 campaign is proving to be quite a solid one, him 5th currently, I don't see him getting a slot in F1 anytime soon. Nor do I see his colleague Zach O'Sullivan doing the same. Simply put, Williams is not looking for rookies right now. They are not in a position in which to be able to give a young driver the leg up and being able to really establish themselves at Williams, or to go on to another team, or maybe even Mercedes. They need two solid, established, experienced drivers to help steady the ship going into 2026, and hopefully a more midfield situation for the team going forward, where they're not at the back anymore and they can consistently go after points, or maybe even top 5 finishes and podiums. Right now, that ain't gonna happen, and so far my prediction of Albon getting a top 5 finish, that's not good, and we're almost at the halfway point of the season. In fact, Silverstone will be the halfway point of the season. So I feel like Colapinto, this is good development as part of the academy, and also he's only in his rookie year of F2, so I don't see him getting the chance of racing for Williams in 2025 unless something really drastic happens. But then again, given what's going on with Carlos Sainz right now, and how reportedly Williams are growing tired of the Spaniards dawdling to make a decision, what with the last-minute Alpine decision to bring him back to Enstone, you never know. The only way I see this happening is if Franco Colapinto wins the Formula 2 championship, or he gets solidly in the top 3 and only missing out on the championship by that much, because right now, the talents of Oliver Bearman and Kimi Antonelli are being compromised by the brand new car. They're not really showing their full potential, as well as Prema really struggling with the brand new car. But either way, Williams aren't hanging around to wait for Carlos to make a decision, since they're busy signing plenty of staff from teams across the board. And so are Alpine, but I'll get to that in a bit. But regardless, the whole thing with Carlos is getting old right now. Williams really do have a compelling situation at the moment. They are getting plenty of hires. They've got about 26 brand new senior staff members, including some really heavy hitters from Alpine, Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull, across the board. This could be a really good situation for Williams going into 2026, as so could Alpine. So maybe that's why Carlos is dithering between Alpine and Williams, because right now they are quite developed. Because quite frankly, at the moment, I would not have much trust in Sauber because, 2024, it's not looking great. In any case, it's just one narrative of many going into Silverstone, and I wish you well, Franco. I hope you do well, and that Argentina has something to smile about in the sense of Formula 1. And hopefully they might get someone close to the likes of Carlos Reutemann, maybe one day. Because I think that many British fans aren't all that happy right now after the furore of the Red Bull ring, which saw Norris and Verstappen tangle to this extent for the first time. Lando discovering quite clearly what it is like to fight with Max for a win of a Formula 1 Grand Prix, and being in equal machinery. The first time I think both men have fought alongside one another, because in the junior categories, Norris was always a couple of years behind Verstappen, so they never really duelled in the same category for either long or at the same time. Norris would look to Verstappen with respect, which given the situation in Austria will be tested considerably. I mean, it's understandable in a way. Lando would have looked up to the drivers ahead of him as heroes or examples for him when he gets a chance to get into Formula 1. You got Leclerc, Albon, Ocon, Verstappen, and yes, even Lance Stroll racing together in karting, in Formula Renault, and then of course in F3. They were progressing at roughly the same time, within a year of one another. Of course, Verstappen got the break with Toro Rosso to be able to leapfrog all of them, but they all came from a certain generation of drivers, which meant they all understood one another. Whenever you see Leclerc and Verstappen dueling and then talking about it afterwards, you feel like they've been friends for a long time, or at least rivals, and they know how each other operates and they can discuss it. Because I remember in Vegas when they got the podium, first and second, Perez was just left isolated, whereas Max and Charles were busy just gossiping about what they did, how they raced each other, how they could improve. There's just that connection. Whereas with Norris and Verstappen, that has yet to crystallize and really establish itself. It has now, and in a really bombastic way. So for Lando to race a person he respected as a youngster, resorting to weaving and aggressive defensive maneuvers, which these days are against the rules, it will sting. McLaren right now are angry, not just with Verstappen, but also with the FIA, because all of their protestations over the radio were effectively left unheeded. The unsafe release that was given in front of Norris had no further action. The couple of times when Verstappen went wide and then rejoined the track, he wasn't punished for that, or he wasn't looked into in the eyes of McLaren. And just there were so many times that the FIA went either against McLaren or just looked away from what McLaren was saying, including the track limits of Piastri. So right now, McLaren are hurting and are backing both their drivers, and Stella also saying that he hopes that the FIA don't resort to what happened in 2021 with Verstappen, and I really don't want to talk about this right now because at the moment, right now, the scale of the situation is not nearly as bad as 2021. It's only just begun and we have yet to see it play out. The championship is not close at the moment. It's still over 70 points. That could change, absolutely. But right now, I just want to see Verstappen and Norris just taking stock of the situation, hoping that they can be mature and not run each other off the track, and maybe just try and have a good clean fight around Silverstone, because if it doesn't, Oh dear. But this is what you get with a triple header if something really major goes down. You get very little time in which to reset. And it doesn't help that Horner likens Norris's driving in the Grand Prix when compared to the sprint as a bit of a hangover. I'm sorry, Christian, that is just the wrong choice of words. Him implying that Lando was drunkenly furious with the fact that he allowed Verstappen through and fell from first to third, and Norris admitted that he described that move as amateurish, that it didn't work out for him. But to use words like that, hangover? No? Okay, Norris was angry, sure, fired up to make sure that didn't happen again. But that in of itself is, no, that was a really bad comment, Christian. And this is right off the back of the whole situation with the Red Bull Legends Parade, and Jos not driving the RB8, and them actually going loggerheads at each other once again, and Marco getting involved, and then Max telling everybody to just please stop it and get over yourselves. And then Martin Brundle implying that maybe because of that, all of the stuff going on in the background, it might have bubbled up to the surface with the old Max resurfacing from circa 2017-2018. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but one thing's for sure. This version of Max Verstappen we're seeing this year is a lot more harried than he has been in the past couple of seasons, maybe akin to what we saw at the beginning of 2022 when the car wasn't quite with him. How both Max and Lando conduct themselves this weekend will firmly set the tone for this year and next year, and maybe even many years to come. But let's remember, there are many other drivers in which to discuss, so let's discuss them and leave Norris and Verstappen be. After their third race in a row with a podium finish, Mercedes are continuing their, as they put it, unprecedented progress back to the front of the F1 grid, with the team vowing to continuously add upgrades to the W15 over the course of the season, in a piecemeal-like manner. They and McLaren were the only top teams to bring updated parts to the track, and in particular, according to motorsport.com, they pointing out a modification to the beam wing area, which has become a very important part in modern F1 cars in terms of gaining extra downforce above the diffuser. Adding extra downforce, you say? Well, watch the FIA regulate that to hell and back in 2026, am I right? With the team finally adapting to the cost cap era of the sport after having the luxury for years of effectively unlimited money, Wolff reckons that the team will have new parts to add to the car for every single race. Okay, that may not be spectacular, it's not as grandiose as just dumping 9 or 10 parts onto the car in one race, but what we are seeing this year is that doesn't always work unless you've got the wind tunnel and correlation to back it up. Because as we've seen with Aston Martin, Racing Bulls, and even Ferrari, when you rush the parts that were meant to come for the British Grand Prix, but instead for the Spanish Grand Prix, you are not necessarily going to get the results that you were expecting. And in fact, especially with Aston Martin, you might end up going backwards when only Williams and Sauber are slower than you. And Fernando Alonso is just ruining his decision and wishing he could have a time machine going back to 2023. McLaren so far have escaped this trend due to the fact that this all came at the right time with their brand new wind tunnel and them being able to calibrate it in the right manner in the direction of where they want to take the car. So okay, so far so good for McLaren. All of the upgrades that they have brought throughout this year and last year have worked. And you've also seen Red Bull not adding huge updates lately and instead bringing maybe tiny little tweaks or modest upgrade packages more at a steady pace than we would have expected. This all before the new rules come in. And of course, sure, Mercedes did benefit from Verstappen and Norris colliding with one another and Russell inheriting the win. But at the same time, Piastri and Sainz were right behind Russell, and neither of them could capitalise, especially Carlos, since he not only couldn't catch up to Russell, he fell back behind Piastri. So far, Ferrari need to figure out their upgrades and what to do, especially with their technical director leaving for Aston Martin, and them having to wait for either Adrian Newey to confirm, or to find another guy. As for who out of the other teams could figure amongst the points for the British Grand Prix, Racing Bulls might have found a decent combination of old and new parts with Ricciardo's car, which saw the Australian get some points out of the weekend, with him overachieving the car in which to do the deed, all amidst the struggles of his own teammate who's currently going through a mid-season slump in not only performance but also regressing back to his old behaviour. But when you compare him to what's going on with Isaac Hadjar and him potentially being the next in line after Liam Lawson in case Red Bull don't take him on for either Racing Bulls or Red Bull itself, then that just makes Yuki Tsunoda look absolutely tame. But either way, it is between Racing Bulls or Haas for a certain challenge for points, after the latter's hugely impressive weekend at one of their strongest tracks, Hulkenberg illustrating especially that he's still got it in not only keeping a wounded Red Bull behind him, but also being able to play around with Perez to some extent and using DRS to his advantage. Now, could Alpine figure in terms of hunting for points? Because 4 races in a row, they have been scoring points, little by little, even though it really doesn't make for much comfort now that Haas have bagged 12 points in one go, and are now much closer to Racing Bulls than they are to Alpine, and also we are still seeing Ocon and Gasly bicker amongst themselves, which could have compromised one of them getting into the points. That's not going away anytime soon, even though Ocon's reined it in and only just doing little nagging things in which to irritate Gasly and the team, instead of taking the guy out or doing really obscene, blatant things. But according to their new Italian hype man, they could be back to winning again in a couple of years, and that he has full powers from the Renault CEO Luca De Meo to enact what needs to be done on his part to get them back to the top again. Do you know what? This makes me think even more that Flavio Briatore is effectively the new team principal of Alpine, because, yeah, I've seen Bruno Famin in the garage over the course of the Austrian Grand Prix, but I barely saw him doing any press conferences or interviews. It feels like he's now just being the day-to-day manager of the team instead of the figurehead and spokesperson for the team. Briatore is a more standout character, and he's a more interesting character when compared to Famin, who has gained a reputation in sacking people in recent months, and instead of that, Briatore is doing the opposite and hiring people, like Safnauer was doing, managing to gain some really impressive and senior recruits from McLaren, Ferrari, maybe not to the same extent as Williams have, but these are big name names, and this is all of course going with David Sanchez from McLaren this year. They are starting to get themselves around the idea of aerodynamics, so this could improve things for 2025 and going into 2026, depending on who they get in terms of a power supplier, be it Renault still, they deem it worthy of continuing, or they go with Mercedes, remains to be seen. But it certainly has been enough to convince Pierre Gasly to stay, even though the chances of Alpine no longer being a works team are possible at the moment, and Pierre Gasly does value the idea of a works team. But then again, it could be a works team in all but name, in that, yeah, it's getting Renault money, but it's not being powered by Renault engines. That might be a fair compromise that Gasly is willing to take, and that he is convinced by what Briatore has to offer. One thing is for sure though, it certainly seems to be more than enough to convince Pierre not to go to Audi, so that's a victory in of itself for Alpine. So this year, it may be damage limitation, next year might be better. So now, let's get on to the predictions. After the events of Austria, Max Verstappen will want to establish himself as the dominant figurehead of Formula 1 once more. He will have a point to prove, both he and Norris, after what happened, in being able to fight at the front, learn from each other's mistakes, and to make sure that all the mistakes that befell him and the team will not happen again, especially at the home track of McLaren and Lando Norris. However, we have to remember that in the past few races, even though Red Bull no longer has the fastest car by a wide margin, it's enough for Max Verstappen to be able to get ahead of any drivers so long as he gets on pole position and is able to dictate the pace of the race. It's only when Lando or somebody else gets into DRS when Verstappen needs to really dig deep and fight hard. But if he can scamper away outside of DRS, it doesn't really matter. He can manage the race. He doesn't have to win by 5, 10, 15 seconds. He just needs to win by maybe 1.5 or 2 seconds or something. So long as he has a big enough gap, he can do it. One thing that might be in their favour is that this is not going to be a sprint weekend. We might just get a situation where it's akin to what happened at the Red Bull Ring, but it goes all the way to the end. Because of course, Norris will want to keep a measure of this whole situation, because I predict he'll be second place, but again, not by much, and potentially within DRS. Because this depends on whether or not both drivers can keep their cool, because right now, I am starting to see a pattern that we were seeing during the Mercedes domination era, of it being ham ver bot or ham bot ver. We are now seeing ver nor, or potentially nor ver. Who else could be in that third place slot remains to be seen at the moment. It could be Russell, it could be Hamilton, it could be Leclerc, Sainz, Piastri, you name it. But the first 2 slots is between Norris and Verstappen. As I said earlier, this is the dress rehearsal this year for next year's championship title. McLaren will be stronger, Norris will be stronger, Verstappen will be keen to wrap up this era of regulations with him winning every single title. What will happen in 2026? I don't know. He might not even be in the sport anymore. But one thing is for sure though, Verstappen and Norris, it's really, for the rest of the season, or at least for a good few races before the summer break, or even slightly afterwards, it's going to be between one of these two men as to who's going to be first and second. Because sure, the Spanish upgrade worked, but it didn't work as expected. It didn't give them the 4, 5, 6, 10th advantage that they had been accustomed to, and what we might have thought after Austrian qualifying, where, oh, Marco was saying that he could be a second a lap quicker, but it's a good thing we didn't get that. Then in third place, I'm putting Lewis Hamilton, because at the moment, Mercedes is really starting to figure itself out, Lewis is starting to figure himself out, and sure, there was a quite sizable gap between he and Russell, and Hamilton did sustain damage, and he was fighting Carlos Sainz for the majority of the race. The fact is, though, is that the momentum is swinging back to Hamilton, and I'm sure that Mercedes will want to focus on giving Lewis the best qualifying strategy possible, in which to give him a good slot, and then rely on Hamilton's epic end-of-race pace to really get himself a chance on the podium, and effectively repeating the same podium lineup that we got last year. This is Silverstone. Hamilton's won 8 times here. He is the most successful driver on the circuit, and that is absolutely bonkers, and you cannot discount him. This is a circuit that he holds close to his chest, and the crowd really does motivate him, because the performances we saw in 2022, the beginning of Hamilton's downwards phase and him feeling really morose with Mercedes, he was still able to get second place and pull off that exciting manoeuvre at the last corner, overtaking 2 cars at the same time. So there are chances for Hamilton to really excel here and really establish himself against George Russell in terms of qualifying, it being advantage George. Then in fourth place, I'm putting Oscar Piastri. Look, McLaren are aggrieved with the FIA. They will have a point to prove. And as far as I can tell, Oscar Piastri could have had 3 Grand Prix victories at this point had things gone the way they did. Or if there was opportunities in Monaco, but as we saw in Monaco, there are very little opportunities if you don't start on pole, or the front row, if you're lucky. And not to mention, we look back to last year. Last year, in his rookie year, he was odds on for getting a podium position, had an unfortunately timed pit stop before a safety car had gotten in his way, and then of course Lewis Hamilton fighting tooth and nail to keep him in 4th place. So he does like this track, Piastri, and I feel like with this upgraded car, and it being the fastest car, and him motivated to do better after narrowly missing his first Grand Prix victory at Spielberg, this is something that's going to really motivate the driver, even though we might not be able to see it in actuality because he really does keep his emotional cards close to his chest. I do feel like Piastri will be motivated to really excel at Silverstone, and depending on whether or not he's cracked the time management issues, because Silverstone is really cruel to its tyres, we might see Piastri get a chance for the podium, but I can't put him any lower than 4th place if he's able to bring the car home. But in any case, the team sense an opportunity for the Constructors' title, if not 2nd place, because Ferrari are really struggling at the moment, and McLaren could capitalise on this. And had it not been for Norris and Verstappen colliding, they might have been able to get within to single figures of the Scuderia. So they could do the deed here at their home track in getting up to 2nd place and mounting a charge for Red Bull, because in the last few weekends, McLaren has scored the most points, 30 more than Red Bull. Then this was a toss-up. It was either going to be Russell or Carlos Sainz, and as much as I would like to say Carlos Sainz for 5th place, I do feel like after the recent uptick in performance and real accomplishments from George, he might just squeak it. I know, British bias, I know you're going to say that, but this being the British Grand Prix, it's going to motivate George as much as it will motivate Lewis Hamilton to do well, if not more so. George will be extremely keen to make the most of the home crowd and get on the podium for the first time in his career. 2022, he didn't get the chance to after getting consistent top 5 finishes. In 2023, he ultimately wasn't able to do so because the car was just not quite good enough to beat a resurgent McLaren and a Red Bull and Lewis. This might be the opportunity for him to be able to maximise from his massive redemption arc from Montreal to Spielberg, going from 3rd place but almost a win to an actual win in just a month. This could be the transformative year that we see from George, that maybe he might be the guy to lead Mercedes. Right now, it's not quite clear. But one thing is for sure though, he is much more confident and the team is right behind him. They are going to be right behind Lewis as well. And if Hamilton does have the opportunity to go for the win at Silverstone, of course he will probably get every single team member of Mercedes right behind him. The same will go for George. But either way, and like I said, if things really kick off at the front, George was more than happy to just sit back and capitalise on anything that goes on ahead of him. Because yes, George is fast, he is quick, but he's also smart enough to recognise, like one of his idols, Jenson Button, that sometimes you don't necessarily have to be right at the front to bag as many points as possible. Because as one of his mentors, Jenson Button, points out, that sometimes, because as Jenson Because as Buttons pointed out in the past, as well as his mentor and idol Alain Prost, sometimes you don't necessarily have to win in order to get what you want. You just have to do enough to be able to be there and figure. But don't expect either Carlos or Leclerc to be miles behind the Mercedes. It's going to be close. But at least these drivers do have options for 2025, whereas these three drivers have very little choice in how they're... But at least these drivers have plenty of choices and opportunities for the future, whereas these three drivers don't quite have that luxury, and their future in F1 is either out of their hands or it's completely done. As I talk about in this video here, that you can go watch immediately after this one. I shall see you there.